My name's Brandon and this is Nickelodeon Video Game History, a show where I take a look back on all of the video games based on Nickelodeon shows and retrospectively review them. The Wild Thornberrys has had a rough start to their video game tenure. Rambler was an awful hodgepodge of gameplay styles, and then the home console debut with Animal Adventures was basically the exact same thing, but on a more powerful system. Today the show gets a third crack at making an enjoyable video game, and for the third time we're on a brand new console. The Wild Thornberrys Chimp Chase was released exclusively for the Game Boy Advance on October 5, 2001. Much like the other games already released, there isn't much info or documentation of Chimp Chase on the internet. In fact, this is pretty much the case for every Wild Thornberrys game. This really intrigues me. Wild Thornberrys was quite a popular show, and clearly it was successful enough to get a mountain of games. Yet, despite this, the memory of them hasn't seemed to have a lasting impact the way Rugrats did. In charge of Chimp Chase were fresh developers Helix. Founded in July of the previous year, their specialty was licensed games. More specifically, they specialised in animated properties on handhelds. During their almost decade-long run, they'd released Jimmy Neutron Jet Fusion, Breakin' the Rules, and the first two TAC games all on GBA. After going out of business in late 2008, some of the employees would establish Double Tap Games, who only lasted a year or two. In this time, their only notable release was a TNA Nintendo DS game. Critically, Chimp Chase didn't do too well from what very little info I could dig up. Managing to somehow score a review from Nintendo Power, Chimp Chase managed just a 4 out of 10, which is obviously a worrying sign. The Wild Thornberrys have had a rough introduction to the video game world. Hopefully Chimp Chase will give us a little more enjoyment than our first two experiences. Before you even get a little bit of story, you'll find yourself thrown into gameplay almost immediately. All of a sudden, you're running around as Darwin, jumping from tree to tree and collecting cheese munchies. The cheese munchies act as your collectible that will give you extra lives. Chimp Chase is extremely generous with these, which I really enjoyed as you'll never have to truly worry about getting a dreaded game over. And the basic platforming controls aren't too bad. They're not impeccable, but they're easy to get the hang of and don't hurt the gameplay experience. Health is kept pretty basic, with the player given 3 strikes before their chosen Thornberry drops dead. After this brief and basic introduction as Darwin, what very little story Chimp Chase has starts to unravel. Kip and Biederman kidnap Darwin, and the Chimp Chase truly begins. Control is transferred over to Eliza, who plays almost identically to Darwin with one extra wrinkle. Instead of being helpless, Eliza can throw fruit at the various wild animals scattered across your journey. This briefly incapacitates them, but they always pop back up without any damage done. Can't have animals being harmed considering what the show is all about. The throwing arc of the fruit is super annoying, which is made even more frustrating by the fact that there are far too many instances where you can't just platform your way out of trouble. You'll be forced to try and work around this annoying form of attack constantly. And that sums up most of the gameplay in Chimp Chase. You'll go through various different environments, navigating wild animals, trying to get back your monkey friend. The developers do try to spice it up though. When you head to the plains level after being greeted by a giraffe penis, you'll find that you're completely helpless and have lost your fruit throw attack for some reason. Further on, you get to play as Donnie, who is essentially exactly the same as Eliza and Darwin, albeit with a slightly faster movement speed. The movement speed just ends up being a pain though, because you use Donnie in an ice level where you're slipping and sliding all over the place. Weirdly, you only get to play as Donnie for a single level. Technically, you do play as him in this Australian level, but that sees him hopping into a kangaroo's pouch for some reason, and you end up hopping around as the kangaroo. The animation for this looks like Donnie's being mounted by the kangaroo. Extremely sus areas here. At this point, it's probably unsurprising when I tell you that the kangaroo controls pretty much the same as all of the other characters too. Every character in this game has a slight difference, but the change up is never significant enough to make these new characters feel truly fresh. At the heart of it, it pretty much feels like you're controlling one character for the whole journey. Eventually you end up back as Eliza in this Australian level, and you once again have a weapon. Here the fruit has been replaced by a boomerang because of course it has. I did find this kind of hilarious. The developers were obviously conscious of having the animals actually get hurt in this game, which is why the animals only become dazed for a bit. But boomerangs were hunting tools. They were used to hunt animals, so I don't know whether it's such a good look to have Eliza hurling this at various critters. On a more positive note, the throwing arc of the boomerang is everything that the fruit attack should have been. It feels so natural to throw the boomerang and makes the limited combat a joy to play in comparison to the early game. In fact, the earlier parts of the game, or more specifically the jungle levels, are littered with these kinds of issues. Climbing and platforming through these trees is so finicky and results in way too many frustrating deaths. It feels like the game is never really registering your D-pad inputs correctly here. Then the actual navigation of the level is a nightmare. The jungle level is quite sprawling and is far less linear than the other levels in the game. Trying to get through this is so confusing, largely due to these arrows. At first I thought they were pointing you in the direction to go, but it actually turns out they were indicating I'd reached a checkpoint. It's a staggeringly poor way to indicate a checkpoint. All you're doing is confusing the hell out of the player, especially because later in the game, actual directional arrows appear. To top it all off, basically every inch of this first environment looks the same, forcing you to memorize the paths you've taken as there aren't many unique landmarks to guide you. All in all, the opening couple of levels are god awful. But then you hit the temple level and suddenly Chimp Chase finds its groove. The game starts improving on all of those little issues present in the opening, and dare I say, I actually started to enjoy myself. For starters, the levels after the jungle massively tone down the amount of animals you need to toss fruit at. This results in levels flowing smoothly, and when they do reintroduce a plethora of animals to take down in Australia, the boomerang makes this enjoyable. The game also introduces occasional new variations to the gameplay, like running away from stampedes or the kangaroo level I mentioned earlier. In a lot of recent Nickelodeon games, these variations would have been completely new styles of gameplay, like making me play Frogger or something. I much prefer this approach because it creates a cohesive experience. These levels really aren't all that much to write home about, but because the bar was set so low with the opening, it comes as a genuine shock when the rest of the game makes serious improvements. But negatives still persist throughout Chimp Chase. The stealth sections are another example of slight variation on gameplay, but it's executed so poorly. I've got no issues with the idea itself, but the timing of these are too clunky. Sneaking in between guards never feels right, and it almost feels like the solution to each encounter is you cheesing the game. While not as bad as earlier on, levels can still be confusing to navigate, particularly the plains level, which almost falls into the exact same traps in this section that's dominated by tree climbing. Chimp Chase also loves to spring enemies on you out of nowhere, creating far too many moments where you can only avoid damage if you've played the game before and you know where each enemy encounter is. It's just unfair and it's not fun. Then the game ends with a massively disappointing boss battle that the game really didn't need. You go through the whole thing without so much as sniffing boss battle gameplay, but of course they have to conclude the game on a completely new style of gameplay. It's one of the worst tropes in video games. You need to suck Kip and Biederman into this machine by hitting a switch with the boomerang. Half the time the boomerang will hit the switch and nothing will happen, and you also have to do the whole thing without taking any damage. Just a really dumb way to end the game, especially after all the goodwill it earned back after the sluggish start. Extra points for this final fight playing out to the beautiful sounds of what seems to be a printer. I've got to knock the visuals too. After playing Castle Capers, Chimp Chase does not look good. It's especially noticeable because these two games are in the exact same genre, yet Chimp Chase is significantly less impressive. Even ignoring that kind of unfair comparison, because software creations are top tier when it comes to graphics, Chimp Chase feels like a Game Boy Color game when you look at it. I don't see that massive leap I'd expect from a new generation, and a lot of this feels like it would have been home on the previous console. Clocking in at around 2 hours, the Wild Thornberrys Chimp Chase has a solid amount of content. It's certainly one of the more fleshed out handheld games so far in Nickelodeon video game history. Overall, it has its moments. Maybe it's because of the bad opening, but there are flashes of what I'd almost call brilliance. The slow improvement over the course of the game is nice, but the DNA of the awful intro is ever present, constantly dragging the game down. What makes those initial levels so awful seeps into everything else, resulting in Chimp Chase being a mostly unenjoyable game. It really could have been decent. It's not so far gone that a fun game couldn't have been extracted from this project. But that might be even more frustrating than Chimp Chase being an unmitigated disaster. Squandered potential is never an easy pill to swallow. It doesn't mean much, but Chimp Chase is definitely the best Wild Thornberrys game so far. Next time, I'll be diving back into another floundering series. Rocket Power has followed the exact same release schedule, with a Game Boy Color, PS1, and now a GBA game being released. Similarly, the games we've looked at have been a mess. Despite all those similarities, I'm crossing my fingers that they'll start to diverge, and Rocket Power Dream Scheme will be somewhat enjoyable. To make sure you don't miss out on that review, hit the subscribe button.